They say that those who do not know their history are destined to repeat it. Well, your future is based on what you learn from your history. But we are in a very important juncture where important decisions are made in the political sphere. For example, the joint opposition is currently engaged in a march from Kandy to Colombo, and on the other side the opposition leader says that this is a sinister move to destroy coexistence. Well, to speak about these aspects of the political sphere, we are joined with Dr. Dayan Jayatilaka with us. And also remember, you can also post your views, your questions, and we'll make sure that we will feature them on our next show. You can email us on Newsfirst@maharaja.lk, and we will be very glad to have them all answered on our show Vantage Point next week. A very big thank you to you for joining us today.
Thank you.
First up, the question I would like to ask you, Dr. Dan, is whether there's an opposition march that's taking place. The joint opposition is currently engaged in the march from Kandy to Colombo, and on the other side, like I mentioned earlier, the opposition leader is saying that this is a move to disrupt coexistence in the community. The question that I would like to pose to you is whether this is a struggle against or a fight against the government, or a fight against recognition for the joint opposition in Parliament. There seems to be a lack of recognition. So is it that, do you think there is a hidden agenda behind this march?
Well, it's difficult to speculate about a hidden agenda, but what I see is that the march would probably not have come so soon had the joint opposition been given its due place in the parliamentary mainstream. Now, the facts of the matter are that in August last year, after the general election, the United National Front had 106 seats, and the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, led at the time by Mahinda Rajapaksa in the campaign, had 95 seats. However, on the morning after, as it were, a section of the SLFP, some of whom weren't even elected, because this included some who had lost in the preference votes, who were brought back in through the back door. They decided to join the UNP in a coalition government. Now that left 50 who refused to do so. Now 50 is more than 3 times 16, and I say 16 because the TNA has 16 members of parliament. But by some strange twisted logic, the TNA was made the opposition, and the TNA leader, who represents only 2 provinces really, was made the leader of the opposition. And the request to make Dinesh Gunawardena the leader of the opposition, because he had the loyalty of 50 signatories, was turned down by the Speaker, Honorable Karu Jayasuriya. That being the case, I mean, where are those voters who voted against the national government to be represented? What are those 50 guys who have refused to betray their mandate and go along with the government? What are they going to do? This is why, it is because they have not been granted their legitimate space and status in Parliament, that I think they have resorted earlier than usual. There are always such demonstrations during the tenure of a government, but this is fairly early in the day. They've resorted to this fairly early because they don't have their due in Parliament. If they did, all of this would be taking place in Parliament, not outside.
But this is dubbed Jana Satana Padayatra. That's the reason why I asked whether there is a hidden agenda. Are they just fighting for lack of recognition, against lack of recognition, or are they actually fighting for the people?
Well, I think they're fighting for what they think are the causes that various social sectors have put forward. Because if you take the newscast every day, you have 5 or 6 demonstrations, not by the joint opposition, but by various sections of society on various issues. So So there is some kind of pressure from below.
But there's a political force behind those trade union actions, don't you think?
Those are not trade union actions. For instance, the hartals of the traders, I find it difficult to think there's a political force, because in each town the composition of the trading community is very different. For instance, in Colombo, where there was this huge demonstration, the Peta Hartal, those are mostly non-singular traders, Muslim and Tamil, who are traditionally UNP voters. But they went on strike. That's because they are hit hard by the VAT. So I don't think, I've not seen on television a single opposition guy out there whipping up the VAT hartals. These are semi-spontaneous social protests. So I think the joint opposition is trying to give this some coherence, trying to plug these in. But of course there's politics as well. I think they are opposing the UNP policies and the policies of the UNP leadership. They are also manifesting their opposition to the UNP SLFP marriage. But the fact that there was a cordial, long discussion between the SLFP MPs of the joint opposition and President Sirisena on the eve, as it were, of the Padayatra's commencement tells me that obviously President Sirisena is not their main target. Otherwise you can't have that kind of conversation. It has to end in a, in some kind of rupture and rude words and so on, but everybody seemed very happy when it was over. So quite frankly, I think this is directed against the UNP government, the UNP-led government or the UNP policies, and that's why is the Honorable Prime Minister, who has been perhaps the most harsh in his condemnation of the Padayatra.
Dr. Jayatilaka, you mentioned, it was very interesting that you mentioned that this is an opposition against the marriage between UNP and SLFP, meaning the coalition government. So do you think it's fair for them to hold on to this? Because it's time that they move past this now, where it's been a long time since they've been opposed to this whole idea. And right in the beginning I mentioned your history is what shapes your future. So in order to shape a country and the history and the future of its people, you think the joint opposition is taking a good stand on this, as in a good move on this? Do you think that the opposition should strive to become something that it has not been before?
Well, I think what they're doing is useful, and I say this because of something that Foreign Minister Samaravira said in Geneva in June when he addressed a seminar in the hall which houses the Human Rights Council. This was a seminar on the sidelines of the Human Rights Council. And in reply to a question, Foreign Minister Samaravira said, look, we don't have a problem with foreign judges and a hybrid court, but the ghosts of the past are haunting Sri Lanka's politics. There are political movements led by former leaders, and that is why we can't have foreign judges and hybrid courts. That is why we have to settle for a domestic judicial mechanism, which of course will include some foreign participation. Now what's he saying? He's saying, look, we would have had war crimes trials with foreign judges, except for the fact that there is this joint opposition led by Mahinda Rajapaksa that's making a nuisance of itself. Now that tells me that what the joint opposition is doing is a good thing, because otherwise it's rather like a market in which there's a monopoly. And if there's a monopoly in a market, there's only the JO, there's only the UNP and SLFP together in government, they'll do whatever they want. It's like a market with one manufacturer. Now there's competition, and therefore the government has to be a little careful about what it does. So that's the reason I think that it's good that the joint opposition is doing what it's doing, and that a section of the SLFP is refusing to go along with this political marriage. Now, there's an ethical problem as well. The SLFP MPs who are with the joint opposition say that they were elected to Parliament on a ticket of opposing the national government, which is true, because in August last year, the UNP said if we win, we are going to have a national government with the SLFP. But the SLFP, contesting under Mahinda Rajapaksa's leadership really last August, said no, we are going to form an SLFP government. We are not going to form a national government. So that's how you had 95 guys elected. Of those, 45 decided to turn their back on that mandate and cross over. But the 50 people who have refused to do so have a moral point. Their point is we can't betray our mandate. And even if we do betray our mandate, we can't go home again, because our voters are going to reject us. So I can see the point they're making. And let's look at it from a commonsensical point of view. The UNP and the official SLFP have declared that they are together. They are wedded for 5 years, which means actually 4 years, because 1 year has lapsed. So it's not 5 years more, it's 4 years more. Now, if we take that at face value, what does that really mean? It means that the SLFP can't contest on its own. I mean, it can try, but it's going to look stupid because they're in government on their own. I mean, it's as if Bill and Hillary they're married, that during the Bill Clinton presidency, if Hillary had crossed over and become and contested elections against him, and that's stupid. So the SLFP can't be in government with the UNP and then contest the local elections or any other election on its own, because what's it going to say? But there is always an anti-UNP or anti-government vote in this country. It may be bigger than the government, it may be smaller than the government. But those guys are not going to vote for the SLFP, which is partner in government. They are going to vote for the joint opposition. So the SLFP guys who are positioning themselves in the joint opposition are also being smart, because the SLFP vote is never going with the SLFP guys who are with the UNP. The SLFP vote, it's an anti-UNP vote. It will go with the ones who are in opposition. The SLFP was formed in 51 and that's 65 years ago, and has functioned for 65 years, 60 odd years, as the democratic and, may I say, nationalist or patriotic, you want to call it that, alternative to the UNP. That's its role and function. You can't plug it in, it doesn't fit, you can't plug it in with the UNP in government. Now, some have been plugged in and they say we are in this for the next for a 5-year term. But that has never been the SLFP's traditional role, so somebody is going to play that role.
So don't you think policies should change with time?
Policies do, but roles don't. I mean, a mother is a mother is a mother. She may change her policy.
You don't see a shift of policy either coming out from the joint opposition.
No, but they would say, why should we change our policy? We were voted in for this. We won. I mean, we are here because we won those. We won the votes, and we won the votes to be anti-UNP. So we are anti-UNP.
Is it just that, or is it just the allegiance towards the former president that it's keeping them intact with the current opposition?
No, because this has been the case even in the 1970s. One first heard about the idea of a UNP-SLFP coalition government in the early 70s. It was proposed by Mr. George Avadana, who was in the UNP in opposition at the time. And it was supported by Madam Chandrika's younger brother, Anura Bandaranaike. But the SLFP rejected it totally. Because asking the SLFP to do that is like asking an elephant to lay an egg. The SLFP was born to play the role of a balancing factor, to balance the UNP. So you can't ask it to change that fundamental, that's a fundamental change. It's not a change in policy. It's not going to plug in with the UNP and stop being an alternative to the UNP and still get the votes it gets. The votes are for that purpose. It's a market niche. There's a demand. So they supply that demand of those who oppose UNP policies and what the UNP stands for. And the SLFP is that alternative. So there's always going to be SLFers, and actually the bulk of the SLFP, because even with state power on the other side, numerically the greater part of the SLFP parliamentary group is in opposition, without even the recognition that they are the opposition, which means there's a huge level of commitment there. I think Mahinda Rajapaksa is a factor, but it's not the only factor. That's why I went back to the 1970s, because whenever this cropped up, the idea of a convergence with the UNP, there was fierce resistance in the Sri Lanka Freedom Party. This idea was associated for the longest period of time with Mr. Anura Bandaranaike. And then Vijaya and Chandrika broke away in '84. Now it's Chandrika's turn to advocate it. She's the one who's pushing this, who has been pushing it from 2005. And Mahinda Rajapaksa is playing the role that she and Vijaya played in the 80s, that is to oppose national government or convergence with the UNP. It's not just the Mahinda factor.
Since we are talking about the joint opposition, Dr. Jayatilaka, there's also much talk about a racist slogan being incited into this whole march, where the fight against the government for the people is being turned back on them, on the community itself. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't see any evidence for it. Now, it's possible that there could be elements to try to bring in singular racism basically into this, and that has happened, say, in the 1960s. In 1966 there was a march led by Buddhist monks, and there were certain slogans which were of a racist nature. But so far I have not seen that. And if I were concerned, and I am concerned about post-war reconciliation, I would say that the most racist thing I've seen recently is the attack on those Sinhalese students at Jaffna University because they wanted to have Kandyan dance, not in place of a Nagaswaram, but for themselves, following the Nagaswaram band. So the attack, and what was said subsequently by Chief Minister Vigneshwaran, that this was opposition to Sinhala culture coming into the north, that scares me, because in this island, I mean, you can have multicultural festivals anywhere in the country. The national anthem was sung for the first time in a long time. in 2 languages. Nobody hit anybody about that. But Kandyan dance at Jaffna University doesn't mean that Sinhala culture is trying to supplant Tamil culture in the north. You can't supplant the culture of people who speak a language that's 5,000 years old. What it means is there's an attempt at cultural cleansing, of a cultural monopoly, that the north should be purely Tamil in its cultural manifestations. Now that is wrong. There is even a case for that. I mean, if you want a pure Tamil culture and nothing else, then there's always Tamil Nadu 19 miles away. But on the island of Sri Lanka, the only thing that makes sense is the policy of multiculturalism. Nobody wanted the Kandyan dance before the Tamil traditional dance. They wanted it afterwards, the second item. And that met with violence, and it was not a clash, because if it was a clash, then there should be injured on the other side of the clash as well. But they were injured only on one side. So it wasn't a clash. One set of students beat up another set of students. Now, when the leader of the opposition condemns the march as being against reconciliation, but does not condemn outright this attack on single students, but says, it was a clash, then that tells me that there's some hypocrisy involved.
Well, Dr. Jayatilaka, with that, let's head into a short commercial break, and we'll see you on the other side of the break. Well, welcome back. You're watching Vantage Point. You're with me, Stephanie Lazarus, and also Dr. Dan Jayatilaka joining us today. There was a speech that was made by President Maithripala Sirisena at the opening ceremony of the recent project. He mentioned that he was removed from the Mahavali portfolio just 2 days after its commencement, when the project was initially scheduled to start. Do you think the previous administration had a lot of stumbling blocks left before ministers who would love to work for the people, and why do you think there was a lot of obstacles that was laid out before their journey towards serving the country?
Well, in the first place, there was a war, so there were limitations. In the second place, they maintained a 5% plus growth rate during the war, and it went up to between 7 and 8 after the war. And most of the development you see is what was done by the previous administration. Now, I'm very happy about Murugakanda. That will be the first big project that this government has completed, not undertaken, because it started under the previous administration, even by President Sirisena's account. Now, he said something very interesting. He said that President Rajapaksa told Basil Rajapaksa, look, give that back. So I think President Sirisena indicated that it was not so much Mahinda Rajapaksa, but Mr. Basil Rajapaksa who tried to monopolize the portfolio or the functions.
So that shows that the family was very much involved in politics.
That shows that having played a major role in doing something nobody else could do, that is winning the war, there was a tendency to replicate to use the same theme in everything else, which was wrong. So the same team that won the war, more or less the family, moved over to the development side and tried to monopolize development. Now, Mr. Basil Rajapaksa might have thought that that was in the interest of efficiency or whatever, but as a model it was wrong. Now, let's also remind ourselves that in terms of development, it worked. You had 7 to 8% growth and you had huge infrastructure development. But it was also wrong and to some extent dysfunctional. Now, I'm very glad that President Sirisena said all that and that he managed to get the money to kickstart the project. And it was interesting, I was watching the footage. The money didn't come from the UNP's best friends in the West or from India or even from Japan. The Chinese ambassador was standing next to President Sirisena. So the money to restart this gigantic and very beneficial project came from China. And President Sirisena mentioned that he had turned to China for this. So I think that shows that China, more than any other country, is the only one that will fund large-scale projects of this sort that are beneficial to the people over the long term, in terms of generation of power and in terms of irrigation. That all the others may talk and may preach to us, but they won't put their money where their mouth is. Only the Chinese have the capacity and the sentiment, the attachment to Sri Lanka to do so, and they've done so. And that's a good combination, President Sirisena and the Chinese. I think that can help Sri Lanka.
Well, talking about that, let's just talk about the US elections, where Hillary Clinton is vying to become the next president, but on the other hand, the polls suggest that Donald Trump is way ahead of the Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton. There's also a lot of outcry from the Bernie Sanders faction of her being elected and being endorsed by Bernie Sanders himself to become the next president of the United States, where it really incites a lot of fear, not only in the United States but in the world over, especially when it comes to international relations and Sri Lanka, and how exactly we are going to iron out a lot of things with America. If Donald Trump becomes president, what do you think is ahead of us?
Well, if you look at it from a Sri Lankan point of view, if I were to look at it from a Sri Lankan point of view, I'd look at it one way. If I were to imagine myself an American citizen and voter, I would look at it quite another way. So let me be frank with our viewers. From a Sri Lankan point of view, I think we'd be better off if Hillary Clinton doesn't win, because she has a history of not so friendly and quasi-interventionist policies concerning Sri Lanka. But if I were an American citizen, I would be voting for the Democrats and not for Trump. Now, in terms of international affairs, the good thing about Trump is that he's willing to take a fresh look at a lot of things. He's not afraid to tell it like it is. He says, terrorism is bad and that Assad is not as bad as the terrorists, and that it was wrong to invade Iraq and Libya. He calls those big fat mistakes. He says he's willing to work with the Russians against terrorism. Now those are good things if you live outside the United States. And he's a businessman, he'll reassess most of these policies. So, as I said, if I'm looking at it as a Sri Lankan, purely as a Sri Lankan, I'd say better Trump than Hillary. But if I were an American citizen voting in the United States, I mean, even as myself, even as Brian Jatharak, if I were an American citizen, I wouldn't be voting for Donald Trump.
Well, with that note, we've come to the end of this edition of Vantage Point. Remember, you can send us your views, you can post us questions in which we will feature on our next program. Our email address is newsfirst_maharaja.lk. please feel free to get on board and pose us your questions, and we will make sure that we will answer them on our next show. This is Vantage Point, and this is where we show that perspective matters. Good night.